My name is Umbrani Dombo, and together with Awari of Bulliman, we are the conference co-chairs for this year. We are incredibly excited that the conference is finally here. For Awari and I, as well as the entire conference team, this has been a long 8-month journey, and we're excited to be here to celebrate it with you. We are particularly excited about this year's theme: Unite, Innovate, Disrupt, Homegrown Models for Africa's Prosperity. This theme has been deliberately chosen and worded in the imperative so as to represent a call to action for Africa to unite, to innovate, to disrupt. We do not believe that this is beyond the realm of possibility. On the contrary, our continent is ripe for homegrown innovation and disruption. All one has to do is to look at how mobile money has completely changed the way in which millions of Africans on the continent transact. That has long been lauded as the key example of homegrown African innovation, but there is certainly a lot more that is happening on the continent, and that excites us. The question is, how do we continue to foster the spirit? What tools are required? How do we spot those opportunities for innovation? This is the conversation that we hope to have this weekend, and we're excited that you're here to join us for it. What better way to kick off the conference than to have Professor Clayton Christensen, the man who came up with the theory of disruptive innovation, to open the conference for us. Professor Christensen is one of the world's foremost scholars on innovation and growth. His first book, The Innovator's Dilemma, received the Global Business Book Award as the best business book of the year in 1997. And in 2011, The Economist named his book as one of the 6 most important books ever written about business. Clearly a very accomplished man. You can read more about his various accolades in the conference booklet and on the conference mobile application. We are incredibly honored and privileged to have Professor Clayton Christensen here with us today to open the conference. Please join me in welcoming him to speak to us. Thank you.
Well, I'm very honored that you would give me some time with you this afternoon. The approach that I'd like to take with you today is to examine a set of theories. And I've tried to depict this on this shelf. As if you went into my office, you would see, figuratively, a shelf on which there are a set of theories about management. And some of them were created by myself and some of my colleagues here. Others of them are contributed by scholars at other business schools. And there are some blank spots because nobody has developed a good theory. The reason why we want to use theory is that a theory is a statement of causality. It's not an opinion of somebody, it's a statement of what causes what and why. And so as we're trying to understand what's going on in the world around us, we can take a problem and then look at the shelf and pick down the theories that we think have some salience and put those theories on like a set of lenses to examine what does the theory say about particular problems. So what I'd like to do with you this afternoon is to pull off a couple of these theories off of the shelf and examine the question of what creates nations to remain in poverty. The reason why it's so interesting to so many people is, look, for example, at Asia. In 1970, Taiwan and the Philippines were right there next to each other, both in poverty. And 30 years later, Taiwan has become a very prosperous nation, and the Philippines still is mired in poverty. And what is it that causes some nations to grow, prosper, and others not? So what I'd like to do now is draw one of the theories down, which is a theory of growth that's called the capitalist dilemma, to try to describe what part of what we think is going on. In order to do this, I want to describe 3 types of innovation. And as we studied this a lot, we decided that understanding innovation is really critical, because whenever we invest in an innovation. And because that's the causal mechanism of growth, we need to understand what the types are. So the first type of innovation we'll call disruptive innovations. And what I've tried to describe here in the circles is they are concentric circles. The ones in the middle, the smallest circle, represents customers who have a lot of money and a lot of skill. And almost always, new markets begin in the center, because the first products are so complicated and expensive that only the rich have access to them. And then disruptive innovation transforms what were complicated, expensive things into products that are so much more affordable and accessible that much larger populations of people are able to buy and use these products. And we call it disruptive innovation. What they do is they create growth. Because if you make something affordable and accessible, more people buy it. And that means you have to hire more people to make it and distribute it and sell it and service it. And so it creates new markets and it creates jobs. And yes, it requires capital. Just as an illustration, 30 years ago, a computer cost $2 million. And so only the largest universities and the largest corporations could have one. And then the personal computer reduced the cost from $2 million to $2,000. So a much larger population of customers could own and use them. And then the smartphone reduced the cost from $2,000 to $200. So billions of people are now able to compute because of disruptive innovation that makes things affordable and accessible. In a similar way, the early automobiles were viewed as toys to the rich. And then Henry Ford introduced the Model T to America, making a car so much more affordable and accessible that many more people could have access to a car. And then Toyota in the early 1960s came to America with a little subcompact that they called a Corona. And it made it so affordable and accessible that the low end of humanity, people we call teenagers and college students today, could have a car. And so that's one type of innovation. And they have a role in our economy. That is, they create growth and they create jobs. Now, the second type of innovation, which has a very different purpose, we call sustaining innovations. And sustaining innovations make good products better. They, as a consequence, are very important in the world. And when you go outside and you look around at innovations, most of the innovations that you see are sustaining innovations. And why they're critical is that they help companies maintain their profit margins so that they don't fail. And it helps markets become vibrant and competitive. But they don't create growth. And here's a way to visualize it. Just imagine that I was a great salesperson and I sell you a Toyota Prius, their hybrid car. If I succeed at that, then you won't buy a Camry. If I convince you to buy our newest, higher performing product, then you won't buy the old product. And so sustaining innovations, although they're critical to keeping our economy vibrant, they are replacative in character. And that's the reason why sustaining innovations don't create growth. They have a different function in the growth formula. And then the third type of innovation we call efficiency innovations. Efficiency innovations allow you to do more with less. And as a consequence, these are very important in our economy, because if we're not getting ever better and ever more efficient, they'll kill us sooner rather than later. Examples of efficiency innovation would include the Toyota production system. Walmart is an efficiency innovation. When Walmart moves into a community and builds a store, they have to hire more people to work in the store. But if you look in the community, there are about 9% of the jobs are eliminated because Toyota is so efficient compared to the other small retailers. And so efficiency innovations, they eliminate jobs, but they create free cash flow, which is also important. So these are three types of innovation: disruptive, sustaining, and efficiency innovations. They all have a role to play in a vibrant economy. And as long as you're creating enough from efficiency innovations, you're creating enough free cash flow that you can invest to create market-creating or disruptive innovations. And as long as these guys create enough jobs so that when these eliminate jobs, we're still growing, they all have important roles. But what's been happening in the world economy in the last 25 years is that this link in the bottom has been eliminated. And so when you see people in Japan complain that they can't grow, and Western Europe that we can't grow, and now America we can't grow, and many of the developing nations, they can't get out of poverty, what's happening is we're not investing at nearly the rate we need to in market creating or disruptive innovations. And the reason why that has been eliminated is, unfortunately, professors at business schools like Harvard teach finance in a way that cuts that link. And I'd like to just describe why that is happening. There are some really important doctrines in finance, and I call them doctrines because it's almost like, from my perspective, finance has become a religion, and the converts are MBAs. And the way we have been taught to think about finance is actually the cause of the dilemma that we're in. So one of the doctrines in finance, which is a good doctrine, and that is that if I array in front of me all of the inputs that I need to have in order to deliver to you the product that I promised, some of these inputs are going to be very costly and very scarce, like platinum. And man, I got to be careful not ever to waste platinum. Deploy it only where it's absolutely necessary. I need to account for how efficiently I use that because of its cost and its scarcity. But others of the inputs will be abundant and cheap, like sand. And you don't have to keep track of whether you waste sand or not. And so just a good example of why this is important. 15 years ago, thanks to Corning and a few other companies, we had fiber optics everywhere. And there just weren't enough applications for bandwidth. And so bandwidth was almost available for free. There were three companies, Netflix, Amazon, and Google, that looked at this doctrine and said, if bandwidth is so cheap and so expensive, let's waste bandwidth. And so they designed products and services that used a lot of bandwidth because it was so cheap. And the people that kept trying to husband the use of bandwidth are all gone today. But those of you who use bandwidth with abandon have become very prosperous. Historically, in finance, we regarded capital as very expensive and very costly and very scarce. And so we taught each other that we need to husband the use of bandwidth. And what I think you'll see is that bandwidth or capital has become very cheap and very expensive. But because we're not using capital, the economies around the world are slowing down to a halt. There are other doctrines in the Church of Finance that cause us to optimize on the wrong measures of performance. And what we're teaching in finance is that rather than look at whole numbers, we should measure success of companies by fractions or ratios. Now, if I'm a manager and I'm holding to internal rate of return, which is a ratio, it causes me to do certain things as follows. So IRR is a ratio. That means it has a numerator and a denominator. And so, sure, I could be more efficient, make more money, and put that in the numerator of the ratio. But what the heck? If innovation is too hard, I just invest in innovations that pay off in the short term, because the denominator is a measure of how quickly I get my money out of the company after I put it in. And as a consequence of that, when I'm measured by internal rate of return, my instinct is to only invest in things that pay off in the very short term. Another ratio is return on net assets, or RONA. And it's a ratio. The numerator is profit, and the denominator is assets. So sure, I could be more innovative, create more profit, and put that in the numerator of the ratio of RONA. But what the heck? If that's just hard, I'll just outsource everything to get assets out of the denominator of RONA. Either way, RONA goes up, IRR goes up, and I as a manager look good. And this is the reason why this doctrine that we teach in finance is so it's creating a lot of problems for the world. The profitability that we measure for efficiency innovations always are more profitable than measures for sustaining innovations. It's just in the math. And the profitability of sustaining innovations are always higher than investments in disruptive innovations. And as a consequence, disruptive innovations always struggle to attract capital and managerial attention. And so the way we measure profitability, as I described earlier, takes the corporation's capital and funnels it into efficiency innovations, which eliminate jobs and take away growth. But it creates enormous amounts of free cash flow. So if I'm a manager and we do this and we got extra cash flow, I have to decide, how will we invest our capital? So we have to have an analyst to think it through for us. And he says, I got this capital. I wonder, maybe we ought to put our capital in disruptive innovations because it creates growth and it creates jobs. But darn it, if we invest our capital in disruptive innovation, it's going to take 5 to 10 years to pay off. And it uses capital. Where we're trying to get capital off the balance sheet, it'll put capital on the balance sheet. So, neat of an idea as it is, I don't think we ought to use our capital to invest to create growth, because the measures take us down. On the other hand, If we use our capital to invest in another round of efficiency innovations, holy cow, there's no risk because the market exists. They pay off in 3 months to 3 years, and it creates even more capital when I'm done. So if you'll just be quiet about this, I think I'm going to use our capital to do another round of efficiency innovations. And then the problem is we have more capital. And I got to decide, how are we going to use this capital? Well, I wonder if we should invest to create growth. But darn it, those metrics, they'll all go down if I do this. So, maybe one more time, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to do another round of efficiency innovations. And then I have the problem again and again and again. And so what's happening in the world is we're using our capital to create more capital, not to create growth. And that's the reason why our economies have stopped growing. And if you want to know where America is headed, just look at Japan. Do you remember, those of you with a little gray hair, which there's none of it here, but in the 1960s and 70s, Japan was growing at unprecedented rates. And this was a nation that had been mired in poverty. And all of a sudden, it starts to grow. Why is that? Well, Toyota made cars so affordable that many more people could own a car. Honda put a bicycle and stuck a gasoline motor on it and disrupted Harley-Davidson. Sony made consumer electronics so affordable that you could put a transistor radio right here for $2. And the reason why you guys have printers in your offices, in your homes, is that Canon did it to Xerox, disrupted them. And these companies and others like them made things so affordable and accessible around the world that literally billions of people were able to buy and use these products. And that meant that in Japan they had to hire more people to make them, distribute them, sell them, and service them. And they became very prosperous. Then about 1990, Japan's economy just flatlined. And since 1990, they have only been able to generate one disruptive innovation, and that is the Nintendo Wii. It made electronic gaming so simple that even old people like me could use it. But that's all they did. And what's happening in the United States now is, as we go through these cycles of using capital to create capital, there is capital everywhere. The cost of capital is nearly zero, and yet we can't invest to grow. In Japan, you could say the very same thing. For 25 years, there's just capital everywhere. Now, the cost of capital is so low that they will pay you to take a loan. And the very same is happening in Europe. So what do we do about this? Oh, I'll just say one other thing. The reason why managers are doing what they're doing to invest, to eliminate growth, and to eliminate jobs is that they're surrounded by data that causes them to do interesting things. So the way you come up with new ideas here is you have to figure out what jobs arise in the lives of potential customers that there isn't anything to buy to address these jobs that arise in their lives. And there isn't any data about products that don't exist that you could develop to get jobs done for their customers. And so all you can do is look around at the context in which people find themselves, figure out, what are they trying to do? What's the job that arises in their lives that they develop a product to address? And data about the context and about what the customers are trying to get done is passive data. It just is in the context, and there are no real numbers about competition and products and so on. But that's the nature of it. When you're starting to build buildings with this, the language that you use is a language of questions. And these things don't happen all the time in a company. Periodically, somebody has an opportunity to create a new product, to create a new set of these growth opportunities, and the data is passive. As a company becomes more mature, the data that surrounds managers changes. And now a manager is just, there's swirling around her data about revenues and products and customers and competition. And very quickly, as a manager, you're just sucked into this view of the world defined by products and services. And you forget what was the original job to be done here. And then when it moves into the the second stage, the language changes. And rather than looking at what customers are trying to get done, we frame the market as defined by products and competition and distribution and so on. And that's a different language than questions. There are processes that allow you to keep making more and more sustaining innovations. And this data is active, meaning it screams out at you if you're not delivering the numbers that managers want. And then when we move into stage 3, which is efficiency innovations, the data changes again. And everybody is focusing on costs and margins and free cash flow. And that's what swirls around managers. And the language that they use is a language of numbers. And so as a corporation loses its sense of what the market and the customers are really needing, they just try to get the measures, the numbers in place so that they can stay in business. Now, I'm wondering why this doesn't... Can one of you guys help me? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So let me now put on a hat of a manager or an entrepreneur in an emerging nation. I always wondered, why might it be that in nations that have so much wealth under the surface, whether it's oil or mining, why is it that prosperity doesn't affect the economy in a significant way? And I think historically we have vilified the managers who run oil companies and mining companies because they seem to be selfish and take the money and leave. But what we decided is that that's actually not the problem. Because oil, for example, these companies are pumping from the ground commodities that are sold in very competitive world markets. And what that means is every time an oil company invests, it's an efficiency innovation because they have to be ever more efficient or they'll lose their place in the global markets. And what that means is every dollar that they invest eliminates jobs. And in a similar way, I just never thought about this before until this theory emerged from our work. Just imagine that the World Bank gives $1 billion or so to Nigeria to run a new 4-lane highway between Lagos and Port Arthur. We always have thought that would create growth. but it actually doesn't create growth. It eliminates jobs because it's an efficiency innovation. And the only thing that causes growth is disruption or market-creating innovations. And so those who have a lot of money and put a lot of investment in aid for emerging nations just are disappointed year after year that their investments haven't made any change. But I think the reason is very understandable now, that their investments are targeted at efficiency innovations, and that doesn't create growth. So let me just give you a few illustrations of how a nation could in fact focus its capital to market-creating innovations that create jobs. And there's a company in India called Godrej, and the owner and his partner or brother all came to the Harvard Business School. And Godrej makes consumer electronics like refrigerators and washers and dryers and so on. But making them in India is just so costly that only the people at the highest tiers of the economic pyramid are able to own these things. But once they realized what this theory was about, they decided, we got to invest to make refrigeration so affordable and accessible that many more people will have access to it. And so their engineers realized that there's an interaction that's called the Peltier effect. And what that entails is you take a wire of copper and a wire of bismuth and connect it together. And if you send the electrons in this direction through the wire, it absorbs heat, meaning it makes it cooler. If you send the electrons in the other direction, it exudes heat and makes things hotter. And so they decided to create these refrigerators using the Peltier effect, not the normal way that we do it here, which is have a condenser and a motor inside. And these are the results, called the Chutacool, which is cold refrigeration. This is the first vision. This is the second that, as you can see, has been designed to be a piece of furniture if you are tired. And it's not as efficient yet as traditional refrigeration, but it can reduce the temperature inside to 2 degrees Celsius. So it can't make ice, but it can keep everything else that you need cool enough to go for a long time. And so what's happened is there are many more people in India that now can own and use refrigeration. That means they have to hire more people to make them and distribute them and sell them and service them, as you can see. Many more people can be distributors. In fact, the post office is the highest. They sell more of these Chutacools than any other distributor in India. And that allows many more people to start businesses that are enabled by disruption. And it makes the link work over and over again. And that's the kind of innovation that creates growth. I was a missionary for the Mormon Church in Korea in the early 1970s. And at the time, Korea was one of the the poorest of nations at that time. And the way you got refrigeration is you got a fan. And you were just miserable for 4 months out of the year. And then a little company there called Samsung developed a fan that had a tiny little motor in it, and it went around, and you could stick the thing right in your face and have relief. And it was so affordable and accessible that literally millions of Koreans now could be cooler. And then they had to hire more people to make them and distribute them and so on. And now, they make the smartphones. But the growth came from making things that are simple and affordable by the Koreans for the Koreans. The automobile industry did a similar thing. When I was there, this is how you got where you needed to go. And because they had 3 wheels rather than 4, they were dirt cheap. And then just after I left, they introduced this one to their market. And then this one, they started to try to sell it in America. And now these are really nice cars. But they were made by Koreans, for Koreans, created growth, created the capability to do good products, and then they sell them around the world. In a similar way, Kia's buses were simply 3 larger trucks off of that platform. And this is kind of a neat way to get around Busan, because you met a lot of interesting people as you went around. And now these are the Kia buses, and they're actually not nearly as interesting as they used to be. How did Taiwan get to where they are now? If you guys have a bicycle that you bought in America, there's about a 70% probability that it was made by a Taiwanese company called Giant. And at the beginning, they weren't racing bikes. But little by little, they made them better and better. And now the world is just flooded with Giant bikes. But they were made by Taiwanese for Taiwanese. Got the quality good enough that they could then start to sell it around the world. And Pace's doing the same thing, right? Because there was a lot of non-consumption of banking. And they developed this system funded by Vodafone and created a company called M-Pesa. M means mobile, and Pesa is the word for money in Swahili. And this is kind of a neat idea that you can just, each of you have a phone and send the dollars through the air to each other. So around the world, these are happening. But our sense is that they're not happening at nearly the rate that they ought to be because of the metrics that we choose. And there is capital everywhere. The cost of capital is nearly zero. And yet, around the world, we husband the use of capital, when in fact, because there's so much capital, we ought to deploy capital abundantly to start these kinds of innovations that create growth. Now, that's, I think, a contribution to our understanding of what creates growth and what causes growth to stop. Now, Efosa Obomo, who graduated here last year, has agreed to stay with us for another year. And he's gotten an insight that I think is really quite profound. And it draws upon another theory from our research that relates to interdependence and modularity. And why this has been such an important theory is that everybody says, well, Clay, get real. Because you could develop products as we described, but there is so much corruption and there is so much regulation that it's just not possible to build businesses in places like Africa that is possible to do in East Asia. And what I learned from FOSA and the application of the theory of disruption is that there's a way to take care of the problem, and that is to integrate. So to describe what I mean by that, in every process, there are steps in the process that you learned about when you took Tom here. And every time one step interfaces with another step, there are two types of interfaces. And one is an open standard interface, where this fits just perfectly into that. And everybody knows how it has to work in order to interface perfectly. And that means that you don't have to do both sides of the equation. You could just do one, and everybody would know, in order to sell their product to you, they have to define the interface so that it fits. And because you don't have to do everything, you just do one piece, you can interact with another company with an arm's length and cooperate and be very profitable. But there's another type of innovation that we might call a closed or interdependent interface, where this side and this side actually don't work together unless you integrate across that interface and be able to change this or change this to account for what's going on in the other side of that interface. And the only way you can solve this problem is if you integrate. In other words, you own both of those things. Whereas here, you can deal with your people cooperating with you in a modular, standardized way. And integrating across that interface is the mechanism FOSA has decided. This is the way you eliminate corruption and eliminate mindless integration, by integrating across the interface where corruption begins. And there's a company here called Toleran. And the owner or his manager here is here today. FOSA, can you introduce him?
Yes, I am the CEO of Solar Africa. So if you ever think that you look in the room and you like it.
And what FOSA realized is there's a job to do, and that is you needed to have nutritious food at a very affordable price. And now I'll try to summarize I hope I don't get the story messed up. But they wanted to make these noodles, and this is a new category in the market in Nigeria. And so they started to make it. But the problem was that the inputs, the wheat and the flour, varied. And because you couldn't count on the properties of the flour, they'd lose their recipe. And in order to control that, they had to integrate backwards to own the supply chain so that it was the same every time. So there was an interface that they had to integrate across in order to get their costs down and the quality up. And then they realized, after they made the products and boxed them, that they'd fill these trucks operated by third parties to send to distributing centers. And darn it, by the time the product got to the distribution center, somehow some of the boxes had fallen off between here and there. And so they had to integrate to own the distribution system because there was corruption and they had to integrate across the interface. And then it turns out they wanted to sell products to other nations in Africa, but there, as in almost every nation, the ports are very corrupt. And ultimately, they had to build their own port so that you could get the stuff to where it was needed to go. And you didn't have to go through a corrupted interface because they integrated around the interface. And to me, this has been kind of two really important insights from the theories about growth. One of the theories is the capitalist dilemma. And because of the way we measure things, we're investing around the world to eliminate jobs. And there is now capital that is abundant that can be turned around and invested to create disruption or products that are affordable and accessible. And this is a game that isn't played just by Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and Chile, but it can be done anywhere around the world if they follow what the theory says. And then the other contribution is about corruption and regulation. And that is, if you integrate around the interface, and there's capital to do that, corruption gets minimized. And that is a cause that many people have said over and over again is a reason why Africa in particular struggles to grow. And that is innovators and entrepreneurs have not yet invested to integrate around the problem. So those are just the ideas that I wanted to share with you. We have about 15 minutes or so. If you have any questions or comments or criticisms or cannonballs, could I invite you to come down, and we have two microphones here, and ask the questions so that everybody can know what your puzzle is. And I'll try to answer it myself or ask Efosa to answer it. Tell us who you are also as you come out.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, if it's a good question.
Well, you might not like it because it doesn't agree with your theory. Doesn't make it a bad question. So, I actually agree with the sequence that you outlined. I think, however, if you look at the social problems that exist all over the world, there's an additional dimension. And I'd suggest that additional dimension is actually equally, if not more, damaging in terms of asset wasting than this. And the issue is that the entire world is focused on either 20% or greater, 120% or greater returns, i.e. market rate returns. It's such a macho thing that anybody who says they're not doing market returns is laughed at by the finance, well, not just the finance industry, the investment industry. But then there's a whole bunch of money going to zero returns, which is the nonprofit world. So most of the social problems in the world would require us to deploy assets in high-impact, modest-return businesses. And we actually need trillions of dollars of those. And in fact, the SDG announcements, the Sustainable Development Goal announcement, was an announcement that we need trillions of dollars of high-impact, modest-return businesses. So a huge asset waste is the fact that if you're macho and you'll only work on 120% or more returns, you can't deploy assets into those businesses between 0 and 110%. And that's, I would argue, as big a problem as the efficiency investment problem. So how do we deal with both those problems such that we get the solutions and we get the jobs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me offer two things, and thank you for the question. The first one is, because there is so much capital, the return on venture capital is an example. The rate of return on that for the last 12 years has been zero in America and Europe and Japan. Zero. And so the idea that there is for-profit and not-for-profit kind of disappears as a distinguishing factor there. And things that were not possible in the past because of what you said actually are possible now. And then another element, I think, of your question, again, which is really important, is that there are billions and potentially trillions of dollars that need to be spent in healthcare or education. And take education. Most school systems in the emerging world are horribly corrupt. The teachers get paid whether they show up to school or not. They're not it's not that they're not well trained. Even if they were trained, the corruption makes the delivery very non-standard. And I think Ephosis is the same. The way you solve that problem is you integrate. And corporations who are growing by doing this need people who have been trained to be literate and to be numerical and to make good decisions. And they have to integrate in order to deliver that, rather than to wait until a government, which is corrupt, does it. And so I think this isn't all of the answers that your points require. But I think that the principles of integration around a non-standard or problematic interface and investing to create growth is more possible than in the past. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity there. Other questions? Down here, you go first, and then we'll call on you second.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Sam Alamayo. I came here from Ethiopia. So this is great, especially the example about Indomni and what they've been able to do and really addressing a lot of the infrastructure issues from corruption or lack of infrastructure in the first place is good. However, when you are an indigenous company, the same way Samsung was or Kia was in South Korea, it is very hard to create a business when the core infrastructure that you need, like roads to get to a port, electricity, communication services, are non-existent, or they're prohibitively expensive. When you're spending 40, 50 cents a kilowatt hour compared to Chinese companies that are spending 6 cents a kilowatt hour, it's very hard for businesses to even survive and exist. So there's a significant amount of money and focus that needs to go into the basic infrastructure. So I understand the 4-lane highway might be just adding more efficiency, but any kind of paved roads are extremely important. When the distance from your market or your raw material is so far away, there are just a certain amount of infrastructure that needs to be in place for any kind of innovation to even be imagined. What do you think about that? And the Koreans have invested so much on that before their businesses could start innovating.
Yeah. Stay there. And just imagine that you were Clay Christensen sitting here, standing here. How would you answer your own question?
Yes. I would say Ethiopia is an example.
Yeah.
I would use...
So
my answer would be, it needs to be invested. And a lot of the money that is out there, their governments need to take an active role in heavily investing in infrastructure. Private sector cannot invest in the infrastructure to make those things.
No, that's not what the theory says or what Clay would say. That's your opinion. What would the theory say in answer to your question?
Well, I would say the innovation, there will come businesses that could innovate for that.
Every type of innovation? Any type of innovation?
No, disruptive innovation will try to make that happen.
That's right. Can the government make that happen?
I don't think you would say that.
That's right. That's right. Let me just say one other thing. So thank you for doing this with me. But there's a gentleman named Chandler who was on our faculty here. And he was kind of the historian of business around the world. And he had this concept he called it the visible hand of managerial capitalism. And what he pointed out is that in 1776, the godfather of economics, named Adam Smith, wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And the concept inside that made capitalism plausible is you had this invisible hand that you didn't see at work, but it just took capital from here and deployed it there. You know, wherever you were making enough money, you put it somewhere else, and so on. And the invisible hand explained a lot. But it turns out that the invisible hand doesn't work if there's not information about how to get this from here to there. And when the invisible hand doesn't have information, it doesn't work. And you need what he called the visible hand. And that is what we've described here, a team of executives that could take capital and deploy it in a different way and make things happen because they integrate. And you can do that within a corporation. The government can't make those decisions because they have to deal with other people at arm's length where it doesn't work, or where there's corruption and it doesn't work. And so what the theory would say is it goes against what we have always been taught, but it can be done in this way. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you.
Somebody back there. This was you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Kevin Lee, aspiring social entrepreneur, and I think my question is, we've talked a lot about theories and a lot about finance and interfaces. How can we bring it down to the human experience? So, in other words, the stakeholder. Because, in finance we talk about return on invested capital, we're talking about maximizing shareholder value, but there's stakeholders, in the entire system that also need to be addressed. And what is fair? How do you, incorporate all of these, these additional people into these things that we're creating?
Yeah. Again, that was a great question too. So stay there. Do you remember what the problem and the solution was when bandwidth was so abundant and cheap? What Netflix and Google and Amazon did? They wasted bandwidth because it was abundant and cheap. And historically, you had to be really careful about how you deployed bandwidth because it was very expensive and you had to husband its use. But when Corning changed the equation, now bandwidth was cheap, then those three companies could waste it. And they had to measure things in a different way. And so now, if the cost of capital is zero, how do you maximize the return on capital when the capital is zero. You can't. And the whole mantra of capital that we learn about in finance was the right thing to do when capital was abundant, was scarce and costly. Now that it's free, then you can start to measure success by how did our investments in education for the people in our company return to make better people, you know? And I just think that the future is going to be very different than the past, including how we measure success. And did I do okay with your question, or are there other?
I guess the point that's still outstanding for me is, what is fair? And we're in a point in society where we talk about inequality, and how do you help everyone do well, not just a certain select few? So I guess I would like to hear some thoughts on how to not capture as much value, but create as much value for everyone.
Well, what you should do is whatever you're doing now, quit and become a professor at the Harvard Business School. Because if you're a professor, you just have to say things. You don't have to do anything. So it's a very complicated problem. But as a general rule, if people are trained to succeed in their work environment and that organization is growing, then you have more and more opportunities to achieve, and it fills in your view of self-esteem. You learn better, and that's the mechanism by which people feel better about themselves, is if they have an opportunity to succeed and grow and learn. And not-for-profit organizations, because they don't have the opportunity to integrate. They don't provide those same opportunities. And so I think, anyway, you see what I'm saying. But thanks for great questions.
All right.
Hear from you.
Good afternoon. My name is Tosin Adesanya, and I actually work for Walmart, and I lead Sam's Club's digital physical integration, really just a group of innovators that are trying to drive multi-channel integration. So my question, and really what you talked about, is a lot of the quandary I think that we're dealing with internally with Walmart right now. What is the perfect ratio? If you were advising Doug McMillan, our CEO, or the board, what is the perfect ratio as far as disruptive innovation versus efficient and sustaining innovation on how to actually deploy capital?
Yeah, boy, that's a good one too. So another member of our team, Tom Bartman, is writing a paper on this very issue. So a company that has a business model goes through a cycle where they start out, if they're successful, they were disruptive. They move into sustaining innovations where they get the momentum to grow and you get the scale. And then you go to efficiency innovations and you maximize and basically you glean the results of what you sowed. And companies just go through that in every nation. The difference is that at the corporate level, they have to take that money and invest to create new growth. So the business models themselves don't change. You change by creating new business models overall, you know. So, but as a general rule, you want to be putting 20% of your capital going after market creating or disruptive innovations, and about 40% on sustaining innovations and 40% on efficiency innovations. And that would change depending upon what you need to do.
Okay.
But that would be roughly the balance.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Hello, my name is Nkemakona Melinda EJ. I'm Nigerian American. And the question I have, or rather the comment I have, is most of your examples showed the Japanese producing stuff for the Japanese to use. I'm a Nigerian. We are not doing a lot of that, of creating for Nigerians what Nigerians use, because we're looking a lot to the West. And most of the Western world speak the profit language. They don't speak mostly innovation language. They speak profit, they speak efficiency.
That's right.
They don't speak innovation. And we need to get back to the language of innovation, because we can't look up to them to create for us what we need. And also we can look up to them to give us the efficiency we need. And the most important thing is capital is not readily available where we all come from. So even if it doesn't cost a lot in the West to get capital, it costs a lot in Nigeria to get capital to start up a business.
Yeah.
So how do we get back to stop listening to the West and listening to ourselves and looking into our own data, which we really don't have a lot of, creating that so that we can create the change we need for ourselves rather than waiting for them to create a change for us. Because if not, aid will never work. It hasn't worked, and I don't know why they still do it. It's not going to work. It's a system that has been tested. I work with the State Department, so I kind of have an idea of that. It doesn't work. So if we here, and I hope that is a discussion we keep having here this whole weekend, is how do we start creating our own language and solving our own problems?
Yeah, boy, good for you. Let me just offer a couple of things. Number one is I've had quite a bit of experience trying to help a company, even huge companies, decide to fundamentally change their behavior, to pursue another strategy. And a theory has a huge role in getting that change. Because if you try to get 20 people around a table and ask the question, what should we do? You never get agreement. And the reason is they all have a different framing of the problem. They have different language, and so they talk past each other. But if you take just these two theories and describe the theories to the people, it provides them a common language and a common way to frame the problem. And some of the issues that you raised actually can be resolved, because part of the language would be, darn it, anytime a multinational corporation comes to Nigeria and creates a factory, actually what that is it is an efficiency innovation, right? And so they might hire people to work there, but as soon as it is cheaper to do it in Rwanda, then they'll move, because and you might want to let them do that, but you need to know that's not where growth is created. And the Americans or the Europeans, they're following the wrong model for growth themselves, And so the issue is, where do we see Nigerians not being able to do something that they ought to be able to do because Nigerians haven't developed the products that are affordable and accessible that they could do it by Nigerians, for Nigerians. That has to be what you do. So, anyway, thank you. I think we better stop with two questions. I promised to give a short answer. So can you go first, and then you'll end?
Sure. Musa Pam, originally from Nigeria. Yes, another Nigerian.
You're not alone.
Yeah. Just, unfortunately, some of these discussions always have to deal with the ugly-headed stepchild in emerging nations, which is corruption. When we talk about innovation, can you speak to how companies should best deal with protection of intellectual property, sort of like in the example of where the Indomie Noodle Group dealt with, how they backward integrate and solve a problem that's common there. And then secondly, for that group, for the Indominudo group, what type of slumber did they put the government officials in those countries where they were able to build ports without the knowledge of the government?
Yeah, boy, you guys, great questions. So I think what Dr. Chandler would say is if you don't have a visible hand of managerial capitalism that can organize things and internalize the problem, you can never solve the problem. And so in his case, he's integrated all the way from the beginning to the end. And it's like a clean conduit behind a really messy society. In India, in South India, they did a very different thing. That is, they built IT companies, and the internet created a clean conduit out of India to the rest of the world where it was clean, and it created lots of growth in the south of India because it was disruptive and And so I think that's the way you need to frame it, is God bless these corrupt people, But we're not going to predicate our prosperity to their cowardice, We need to... Anyway, that was a great question. Thanks. Last one.
Thank you. My name is Amar Ahmed, and I flew in from D.C. I work in the telecom industry. Originally, I'm from Sudan. So my question is, you speak of ubiquitous capital. Just to keep it brief, how does globalization affect the value of this capital? Does globalization effectively quantify the true value? The reason I ask this question is because in an increasingly globalized world where the boundaries of nations are disappearing, you effectively have the installation of an international government, which is central banking system. So, first of all, how does this affect the global market in terms of quantifying the capital? And is this good or bad for developing nations?
Jeepers. I don't have much to say. Yeah, I think the theory has a boundary, and I'm not sure it applies to your question.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry?
Oh, I didn't hear your answer.
Oh, the only thing that we would add, I think, is that I deeply believe that return on capital will become an irrelevant measure of success around the world. And in some way, we need to have measurements about our investments in our people to become better, more capable people. Those measurements will emerge over the next 5 to 10 years. And so some of the problems that you're seeing, I think, will resolve through that process. But we need to let everybody else go. But I'd love to talk with you more, because
thank you.
I need to learn from you. Thanks. Well, you guys, thank you for being patient.
So on behalf of the Africa Business Club, we'd really like to thank Clay for joining us this afternoon. As you all know, the theme is Unite, Innovate, and Disrupt, and Clay is one of the fathers of disruptive innovation. So it was very important for us to have Clay here today to talk to us about innovation and tell us about his theories. So just join me to give him a round of applause again.